Well, welcome to another episode of Cage Free Theology. I'm Clint Archer.
And I'm Will Brannon.
And what's our question today, Will?
So our question today is, what is a literal hermeneutic and why do you read the Bible that way?
Okay, well, this is actually a question that came from one of our subscribers, Kylie Irwin. So I hope she's listening to this. Let's get into it.
Okay, so our last couple episodes, we talked about eschatology and pre-mill and post-mill and all of that. We talked about dispensationalism. And once you start having those conversations, you inevitably come back to how do you read the Bible? Right. So in a nutshell, when you say you advocate for a literal hermeneutic, what do you mean by hermeneutics and what do you mean by a literal hermeneutic? Can you define that for us?
Yeah, so hermeneutics is the art and science of interpreting the Bible. It's a science because there's certain skills that you have to learn. You know the original languages. You learn about near context and far context and the analogy of the faith, the Bible interpreting the Bible, and historical grammatical rules and syntax and all that kind of stuff, understanding different genres. That's the science part of it. The art part of it comes into sometimes you just have to make a call. This could mean that, could mean this. And that's why you have different denominations. So that's hermeneutics. A literal hermeneutic refers to the preference when you're interpreting a passage, giving the preference to the literal meaning, the meaning that the text actually says, what its most obvious denotation would be as opposed to a connotation. So a denotation is this is what it says, and a connotation is this is what it makes me think of. So if we say the White House released a statement yesterday, the denotation is that the building actually spoke. But the connotation is that the president spoke or somebody on behalf of the president spoke. So depending on, you can use metaphors and symbols, and depending on the genre, you might favor a connotation. But either of those is still going to be a literal interpretation, as opposed to symbolic, which is, this represents something else than from what it says. So when it says the lion and the goat lie down together, then what that means, the denotation is that two animals lie down together. The connotation is that there's peace among the animals. But if you were taking a symbolic reading of that rather than literal, you would say it represents peace, perhaps among nations or in the church or in your heart or something that's not actually to do with the animals.
So when you talk about literal hermeneutics, you just mentioned you're looking at grammar, you're looking at syntax, you're looking at context, you're looking at simile and metaphor, genre, all of those things. And that's important to bring out because sometimes people hear literal hermeneutics and they think it's this absurd, almost like a wooden literalism. When you read the Bible literally, you do take into account figures of speech.
Yes, it's not unliteral to use metaphor. I often say, well, we know that Jesus wasn't a door.
Right.
He says, I'm a door, but he didn't have hinges on his side. He doesn't have a knob growing out of his stomach. Like he's not a door. We know that that's representing something else, but that's still a literal hermeneutic because the literalist is just asking if there's a metaphor, if there's a simile, if there's a figure of speech that represents something else, what is it representing?
Right.
What would the original reader recognize that as representing?
And where a lot of debate comes in with a literal hermeneutic is how you apply that hermeneutic specifically to prophecy and passages of prophecy. So yes. I took a class once on the book of Revelation, and I remember the very first class when the professor was talking about how to read Revelation, one of the things he said is you have to keep in mind that when you read Revelation, every number is symbolic. You should not read the numbers literally. And I remember thinking, but why? Why do we make that claim? So can you give some examples of how do you read prophecy literally? And can you give some examples of what that might look like or why you read it that way?
Yeah, it often comes down to the circular reasoning of, how many apostles were there? Well, 12. And that means literally 12. But then when you talk about the 12 tribes of Israel in Revelation, with 144,000 each, people representing each one, what does that mean? Well, no, it doesn't mean 12 and it doesn't mean 144,000. It must mean something else. Well, why? And they say, well, because of the genre, because we're in apocalyptic literature. And then we say, well, how do you know you're in apocalyptic literature? Well, because the numbers are symbolic,
Right.
So of course, there's indications that you're in apocalyptic literature, but it's not always. That doesn't mean that every number is always completely symbolic. When if it says that Jesus is riding a horse, doesn't mean he's riding an innumerable number of horses. It means one horse in that count. There were 2 witnesses. That doesn't mean we have no idea how many witnesses there were. Well, there were 2. That's what the word means. And so when it says that there's 1,000, the time period of the millennial kingdom will be 1,000 years, and that Satan is bound by a chain, then we take it as 1,000 years. I mean, why wouldn't it be? It's giving us the time period. How else could he say that if it were 1,000 years? Is there any other way he could have said to make it more clear? No. I forget the exact part of your question again.
Yeah, Jess, do you apply that literal hermeneutic to prophecy?
Yeah, I do. Now, again, symbolism is okay. A literalist still looks for symbolism, but you always ask, what is it symbolic of?
Right.
The point of using a figure of speech is to make language more clear, not to make it unclear. But whenever I use an analogy in my preaching, it's going to be to make something more clear. I used an analogy earlier of the White House, for example. I'm not trying to be mysterious. I'm trying to make things more clear. So when a metaphor is used, when God says that I'm going to wipe out your crops and I'm going to send the locusts and they will be like the sand on the seashore. Well, yeah, I understand that there's going to be fewer actual locusts than there are grains of sand on the seashore, but I know what it's representing. It's representing the innumerability of that plague.
Right. And in the book of Revelation, just as an example of where some sort of symbolic meaning and a literal number can go together, you think about that there are letters to the 7 churches, and he says that there are 7 lampstands, and the lampstands are the churches. So clearly there is a symbol to the idea of a lampstand, what that means about what a church is, what it should do, and how many churches were there in Revelation 2 and 3. 7. You have this symbol, but the number isn't necessarily obliterated simply because a symbol is involved.
Right. And the reason God chose 7 churches to address instead of 8 is perhaps because he is trying to communicate the completeness of that, and that these are typical churches, and that all churches, these are being addressed to all types of churches everywhere. But that still doesn't mean that you have no idea what that word, how many churches there were. There were 7.
Right. And we see this other literal prophecies related to Christ's first coming. So we see like Jesus coming on a colt, literal. We see that he would be pierced, literal, that he would be born of a virgin in Bethlehem. So we're trying to read all of Scripture, including prophecy, in a consistent manner.
Right. Yeah. And consistency is the big deal. That literal hermeneutics tries to be consistent in every genre throughout the Bible, whereas the people that aren't using a literal hermeneutic, they might say, well, we're taking this narrative literally. When it says Abraham had 12 sons, they're actually 12. But we're not going to take it literally in prophetic literature or in apocalyptic literature. So they would lean heavily on the different genres, and it could be argued that they're arbitrarily picking which ones to be literal in. And when you're literal all the way through the Gospels and Acts, but then suddenly you get to Revelation, you're like, nope. Well, it's a new genre, so nothing in here can be literal.
Right. So one of the objections a listener might have, or even a question they might have, is what about passages that seem to indicate we should reinterpret or symbolize certain verses because of Christ? So a verse that's used to support this is 2 Corinthians 1:20, which says, "For as many as are the promises of God in him," meaning in Christ, "they are yes," which tells us we should find a way that all of these promises are fulfilled, even if it's in a spiritual way, through the first coming of Christ and his death, burial, and resurrection and his spiritual reign. Now, so would you say that there are verses, including 2 Corinthians 1, that teach that we should spiritualize various passages, and why or why not?
Well, I think that you can't look at a passage and say, well, I have to make this somehow related to Christ fulfilling it literally. So the example we used before when we were speaking about dispensationalism in the previous episode was the land. The land promised to Abraham and his descendants. Something was fulfilled in those promises to Abraham when Christ came, that all the families would be blessed through his descendants, for example. But that doesn't mean that the land prophecy must mean something about Jesus and that he is our land and he is our inheritance and he is our new country. And I just don't see that the original readers and recipients of that literature would have made that connection.
Right. I've heard the illustration used of, think of a river. The river of God's promises will all flow through Christ. They will all culminate in and come about because of the work of Christ. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't change the original meaning of them. Do you think that's a helpful illustration to use, as far as we do say that all those promises are yes in Christ, they will come through Christ, but that doesn't mean that we have to spiritualize what they say?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Now, a complication comes in that when you sometimes look at the examples of New Testament authors and how they interpret a passage in the Old Testament, sometimes that can, at first glance, seem non-literal. So one of the classic examples is where Matthew talks about how Joseph, Jesus' stepdad, gets this vision that he needs to take Jesus to Egypt, and so he does. He and Mary escape to Egypt with Joseph, and then later comes back to Israel after Herod has died. And Matthew makes the comment that this was to fulfill the prophecy, "Out of Egypt I called my son," and meaning that before Jesus was even born, there was this idea that he would be in Egypt and he would come out of Egypt. But the quote from Hosea, I think it's Hosea 11, the quote from Hosea, if you go and read that context, is not talking about the future Messiah coming out of Egypt. It's talking about the nation of Israel when they escaped slavery. So at first it might look like, well, the original meaning was the nation of Israel coming out of Egypt, and Matthew has reinterpreted that to make it Jesus. So I think that's probably the hardest of all the passages for us to reconcile. I would highly recommend Abner Chow's book, The Hermeneutics of the Biblical Writers, and he has a great chapter explaining that and how the biblical writers were often doing something where they're looking at a big picture, and what they're saying is not reinterpreting it, but adding nuance to what was there. I'm not saying all of these are easy and simple, but I think that it's a far superior way of interpreting scripture is to always give preference to the literal hermeneutic where possible, than to say, well, we really have no idea what this passage means, and we're going to look at just different commentators and what they say.
So a rule of thumb, trying to boil this down so our listeners can have principles to take away and help them in their Bible study. A rule of thumb you sometimes hear people say with studying the Bible, especially if you adopt a literal hermeneutic, is if the plain sense makes sense, seek no other sense.
Right.
Can you explain that a little bit and give an example of how you might apply that?
Yeah, if you read something in the Bible and it can just make sense exactly the way it is, then you favor that as the most likely reading. It would be very unusual when the most likely and the plain sense of that text wouldn't mean what it says. So when Jesus says, "I'm going to rise in 3 days' time," there's no reason to take that as symbolic of "I'll rise someday." He means 3 days, and then you go and look at what happened, and yeah, it was 3 days. And so when it says, the tribulation will last 7 years, I mean, it could be symbolic of an indefinite amount of time, but that wouldn't be the plain reading of the text. That wouldn't be the most simple reading. The simple reading would be 7 years. Now, if you read something where Jesus says, "I'm the good shepherd," or "I'm the door," well, the plain reading there would be that he's an actual something made out of wood with hinges and a doorknob. And obviously that's not what it means. It's clear. The plain meaning doesn't make sense in the passage there. He's not actually a shepherd. He's speaking symbolically. So then the next question would be like, okay, so what is the most likely thing this is talking about? What do you think it's representing?
Right. So kind of an added principle to that. If the plain sense makes sense, then read it that way. And another question that people can ask is the plain reading absurd? It would be absurd to interpret Jesus as saying, "I am literally a door." Right. And not long ago, I preached on Revelation chapter 5, where Jesus you have this vision of the Messiah as a lion and a lamb. Well, it would be absurd to say Jesus transformed into a lion, literally, and then transformed into a lamb, and now he's an animal for eternity. That's clearly not the original intent of the vision. So we're not saying literal to the point of absurdity. We're saying let the plain meaning stand, unless there's a reason in the context to take it otherwise.
Yeah. So one of the places where this becomes important is when you're speaking to Catholics about their view of communion.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Because they will say, well, we're just taking the literal meaning of the text. Jesus says, "This is my body," when he held up some bread, and "This is my blood," when he held up some wine. So therefore, we need to come up with a system that when we eat the bread, we believe it's actually his flesh. And when we drink the wine, it's actually his blood. So we build a whole system around that. Whereas that would be an overly literal, like a hyper literal reading, which the Catholics do not do consistently with other passages. But a literal reading of that would be like when Jesus holds up a piece of bread and says, "This is my body." It's representing something because we know it's not his body. It's that would be absurd to say this is a piece of my flesh because it says it was a piece of bread.
Right.
So then we have to think, well, I wonder what that represents. Okay, well, now you get into hermeneutics as the art part. What does it represent? Well, this is the body I want you to partake in. I want you to do this in remembrance of me. And so there becomes some interpretive stance there. But it would be wrong to say that we are literal, and so then everything Jesus says we have to take, even if it sounds absurd.
Right. So let's apply this to a real world example. A passage that sometimes comes up in these discussions as far as reading it literally or symbolically is Isaiah chapter 2. Mm-hmm. So what I want to do is just read a couple verses from Isaiah chapter 2, and then let's talk about how would you read this literally, and then how might somebody read it who's taking more of a spiritualized meaning. So okay. Isaiah chapter 2, I'm going to read verses 1 through 4.
What version are you using there, Will?
I'm using the Legacy Standard Bible. Ooh. Yes.
We should do a whole
we could do an entire episode just on translations and the Legacy Standard Bible, which I very much have enjoyed using and teaching from.
Okay, so where are we?
Right, Isaiah 2. Notice I say Isaiah, and Clint, say that word again.
I'm going to say it the way Isaiah's mom would have said it. Isaiah.
Mm-hmm. I can't do it. Okay, Isaiah chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. The word which Isaiah the son of Amos beheld concerning Judah and Jerusalem, now it will be that in the last days the mountain of the house of Yahweh will be established as the head of the mountains, and will be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it, and many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may instruct us from his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For from Zion the law will go forth, and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem, and he will judge between the nations, and will render decisions for many peoples. And they will hammer their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war." Mm-hmm. So how would you read that text? And then we'll get into how might somebody who has more of a symbolic or spiritualized understanding of that read it.
Right. Okay. Well, a hyper-literal version we would reject is trying to, it would be absurd to think that nations are a stream of water, for example, and the head of the mountains that has to have hair and a nose on it. That would be hyperliteral. That would be absurd. So a literal reading of this is just simply that it is representing something. Well, what's it representing? It seems to me that the clearest reading is that at some point in the future, there will be the mountain of the house of Yahweh will be established as the head of the mountains. So the place where God's worship is will become the most prominent place, and it'll be lifted up above all the other places, and that nations will stream to it. Well, nations will come from all over, and they'll want to go there and they'll want to worship. And this part, especially where it talks about, he will judge between the nations. I believe that Jesus will be part of governing the countries. There will be a one world government under Jesus, and he'll be the governor. And then this part that talks about in verse 4, they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. And this, in fact, is a verse that is on the statue outside the United Nations building. It's that famous statue of a gun that's barrel has been tied into a knot. And the point there, they get it. This is representing world peace. And that's ostensibly the role of the United Nations. They don't do a good job with that. But anyway, so I think that a literal view would be like, well, when they're kind of mocking us, they say, oh, so the world's going to go back to an agrarian society where there's no guns and tanks and everyone's got swords because that's what that says. Well, no, I'm willing to admit that Isaiah had never seen an AK-47 or a Sherman tank, but his point there is that the weapons of warfare will be repurposed to be tools of agriculture. Why? Because there's no need for war, because the Messiah is there and there's world peace. So I'm okay with it being representative of something. You always want to ask, what is the metaphor for?
Right.
I wouldn't say, well, we read that and it just means that Christians will have peace in their hearts because Jesus has rescued them from their sin. I'm like, what about that? How do you draw that connection? I can draw a connection between modern world peace and that passage and say maybe the sword represents lethal weapons like guns. And nation will not lift up sword against nation. They're not going to aim their nuclear arsenal at each other anymore, and they're going to repurpose all that technology for producing food. But you can't draw a line between that verse and peace in your heart or peace in the church.
Right.
That's just not there.
So you would say this is a still future promise that you mentioned a couple of times that will come about when Christ is reigning on earth. This is brought about on earth, not some sort of spiritual reality. Is that a right summary of your interpretation here?
Yeah, again, I don't think that this is the verse that you would build that theology from, but remember our definition of theology, our kind of layman's working definition is theology is when you keep the whole Bible in mind when you look at one verse. And I think along with the other prophecies that talk about Jesus coming in judgment, in his second coming, he's going to establish a kingdom. It's going to last 1,000 years. Satan's going to be bound. He's not going to be deceiving the nations. When I read this passage, it fits in nicely with that. There's nothing contradicting. This would be a wonderful picture of that world peace that is not really possible right now, but would be possible if Jesus was here, like it says in this passage that he would be.
Right. And then if somebody's coming at this from the spiritualized meaning, you would put more of an emphasis on these promises of peace and knowing God's law, the nation streaming. This is the spiritual reality of the church. I actually heard a pastor preach on this passage once, and he said, we fulfill this passage every time we meet as a local church, because you have peace among the body, you have people coming to learn to walk in God's paths, to be instructed with his ways. So this is a spiritual image of the spirit, the work of the church in the present because of Christ's first coming.
Right. I think that would be a typical way that people would use that in their interpretation.
So do you have any other observations you want to make on hermeneutics, or specifically having a literal hermeneutic?
No, not that I can think of.
Okay, so we are going to introduce a new aspect to the show that we'll throw in from time to time. We've been getting some subscriber questions, and every now and then as those come in, we will answer those at the end of various podcast episodes we do. So today we have a subscriber question from Elijah4840. And he asks, could you explain why the day of the Lord in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 2 is referring to a short, fixed period of God's wrath rather than the entire 70th week as it's interpreted elsewhere?
Right. When I read that comment, I must confess I'm not 100% sure what Elijah 4840 is asking, where he's getting that idea of the interpretation being a fixed week. But I thought it might be helpful for him and whoever else is listening, that just to talk about what the day of the Lord is.
Can I read 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 2 really, so we know what we're talking about? So 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 2 says, it picks up in the middle of the sentence, but it says, that you may not be quickly shaken in your mind or be alarmed, whether by a spirit or a word or a letter, as is from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. And then he goes on to describe why they should not be deceived in the man of lawlessness coming.
Yeah, so the context of 2 Thessalonians is that Paul is writing to this church in Thessalonica where he believes that some people have panicked about being in the day of the Lord, that they've kind of missed the rapture perhaps, or that they've missed some sort of promise, and maybe because of the level of persecution they were in, that they're in the day of the Lord. So the way Paul is using the word day of the Lord there is a time period of judgment and wrath that was promised in the Old Testament. So a lot of the minor prophets and some of the major prophets as well refer to this period of the day of the Lord being, the day of God's judgment, the period of God's judgment, the age of God's judgment. And it's generally it's quite a general term. Just means, that's the day, what we call Judgment Day. Man, you're going to pay for that on Judgment Day. Well, we're not talking about a 24-hour period. We're talking about when God judges. And so that's how they use the word day of the Lord. Now, the 70th week that he's talking about refers to a prophecy in Daniel where there's these 70 weeks of years. So each week is a 7-year period. And after the 69th week, so it's from a very specific point in history to a very specific point in history that you can count, and they're all in a row, these 69 weeks of years. And when you get to that point, if you do the math, it's when Jesus comes in his triumphal entry into Jerusalem to be sacrificed. But what happens to the 70th week? The 70th week Daniel talks about is a week of years, so 7 years of judgment and wrath. And that hasn't happened yet. It just didn't happen after Jesus died, because it says that it's still coming in the future. And maybe you and your expertise in the Olivet Discourse can tell us some passages of where it talks about this 70th week of judgment still coming in the future. And so in a pre-tribulational, premillennial, dispensational hermeneutic, that's going to fit into the 7-year tribulation that we believe is going to happen. The 7 years before, Jesus comes, raptures the church, there's 7 years of judgment, and then he comes to establish the 1,000-year kingdom on that particular timeline. So that's just one way of trying to fit that 70th week in. And I think that is what Paul's talking about here, where he says, after that, he says, somebody received a forged letter from me to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Somebody was just messing with these people. And he says, let no one in any way deceive you, for it has not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, who believe is the Antichrist, the son of destruction. And it goes on to describe him. So what he's saying is, no, you're not in this tribulation period. God is not pouring out his wrath. There's certain things that need to happen before that judgment of God arrives. And those things, you'll spot it when it happens. You'll know that there's an Antichrist.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great answer. The only thing I would add is, as you study the day of the Lord throughout Scripture, and that's a whole another episode to really go into detail on this, but you can see kind of many days of the Lord. There's not just one. You have a variety of kind of small, you could think of it as a microcosm or just a little day of the Lord, but there's still this building expectation throughout Scripture of a final day of the Lord. So that will end in God defeating his enemies and delivering his people. Those are both aspects of the day of the Lord. So we would say the entire 70th week is the day of the Lord.
Right.
And then it culminates in this final climactic event, the return of Christ, Revelation 19. He slays his enemies, all these cosmic signs come about. So the whole thing is the day of the Lord, and it's building towards this final day of the Lord moment at the end. What you got there, Clint?
I just got some books if you're interested in the day of the Lord and reading about it. This is the one I recommend most highly for you, just to understand a little bit more about the premillennial, pre-tribulational view. It's by John MacArthur and Richard Mayhew. So Dr. Mayhew did his own dissertation, his doctoral dissertation on the day of the Lord. So he really is like the expert on that. And you don't want to read that because that'll be boring. But this is a good.
It's the Reader's Digest version,
right? Futuristic premillennial primer is what they refer to this one as. Christ's prophetic plans. Here's another one just about the kingdom. I hope this doesn't put anyone off, but this is by Tim LaHaye, the co-author of the Left Behind series, and Thomas Ice. And it's they're the editors, but each chapter is by a different premillennial writer, and it just explains different views of the day of the Lord and rapture and the kingdom, and a very good one for that. So, and then Understanding End Times Prophecy, a comprehensive approach by Paul Benware. This was a textbook of ours in seminary that just helps you understand prophecy about that. He's from Dallas Theological Seminary. And then the Coming Millennial Kingdom by Donald Campbell and Jeffrey Townsend, a case for premillennial interpretation. So these are just some books that I would recommend. Do you have anything else for us?
I don't think so.
What's our next episode going to be on?
So on our next episode of Cage Free Theology, we are going to talk about how do you find a healthy church?
Ooh, that's a good one. We'll see you then.